All right, we're back. We're here with Jacob. How you doing, Jacob?
I'm doing amazing.
Amazing.
Yes.
I think you have two blogs. One of them sort of more personal development. The other one is kind of more political. You've interviewed Sebastian Jensen. That makes two of us. You've looked at the Joseph Bronsky thesis of leftism and mutational load. I'm a big critic of that. I actually put out a 12-part series trying to debunk that thesis.
Which I
Um,
read all of them except the one about the sex and the cat ladies.
no one likes the sex and the cat ladies. I thought that would be my best piece ever. I thought everyone would love that. I reached out to all of the people who did that study, and I'm like, can I interview you about sex with cat ladies? And, none of them responded. I'm sure they'll get back to me eventually. But I thought I really think that scrutinizing the sex lives of conservatives and liberals is very important, and we should all be hyper obsessed about it. And the fact that we're not is a moral stain on our society. But uh, that being said,
So,
I've been very critical of the Bronsky thesis. You interrogate that. What's your angle? Is he right about everything? Is he right about some things? What's your take?
well, the way I look at it is that it's improbable that because how heritable political values are, that the change we've seen over time is purely environmental. And we know selection pressures are going opposite in the direction of leftism. If you can, it still is there if you control for immigration, so it can't be genetic drift. So if it's not genetic drift and it's not selection, it has to be mutational load. Just proof by deduction.
Okay. I disagree. I disagree because I think that all of the leftward drift can be explained by environment. And I think it's necessarily the case because I don't think that there's enough, like you mentioned, that there's a selection pressure for conservatives. But if you look at the birth rate differential in 1990, it's really not big enough to produce a huge outcome. You also have to consider the elite theory of politics, which states that people change their political opinions not just as a result of their personality type, right? So if we had an mRNA vaccine that would change people's genes so that they would be more open, then we'd have a more leftist society. If we made them less open, they'd be more conservative, right? So there are these genetic factors, but most political change I don't think is accounted for by changes in genetics. I think it's accounted for by changes in ideology, and ideology is determined by elites. Now, that's a kind of a very abstract claim, or like, what do I mean by elites? And it would be, we could kind of get into the details of that. But what I would basically say is, if you look at wokeism as a phenomenon, I have an article on this called Gen X Invented Wokeism. Everything that we call wokeism is derived from Gen X K through 12 school teachers. That is the generation that caused wokeism. It wasn't social media. Social media amplified it and made it more visible, made it more viral. But all of the underlying beliefs, so beliefs about sex and gender, the transgender phenomenon, all of that comes from K through 12 school teachers. Now, what happened to make Gen X so woke, and how did they fly under the radar, and why does no one talk about Gen X? That's kind of a separate thing. They're sort of this invisible. I call them the Juvenalian generation, referencing Bertrand de Juvenel. So they pretend that they don't exist, that it skips straight from boomers to millennials or something. But they're actually the most powerful generation in history, is my contention. And they're woke. And then the question is, how did they become woke? Well, if you're going back to 1965, which is the beginning, or let's say 67 is the beginning of Gen X, if you look at conservative versus liberal birth rates during that generation, the differences just aren't enough to account for the massive political shift. So, like, you can't explain the sexual revolution of the 1960s with that kind of shift. We're talking about, of course, today the shift is like, it's 2.5 TFR for conservatives, 1.5 for liberals. It was just a much more narrow gap, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So I just think the selection pressure is way too small to explain the magnitude of it. And therefore, we must deduce that this is environmental. It's the result of technology. I would argue that technological change, American victory in World War II. I mean, one of the funny things about this is if the Nazis won, which is conceivable, we'd be living in a more right-wing world. Like Europe would be more right-wing. Probably America would react to that and kind of be more conservative as a result, due to the aggression of the Nazis or whatever. The Soviet Union would have been more conservative in certain respects if it had survived at all. The Japanese, clearly, right? So we can easily imagine historically contingent events being different and the world being much more right-wing. So that to me just shows that environment, at least in short-term periods, determines political ideology way more than genetics. Now, in a long-term period, you could argue that, for example, I don't know, the Black Plague or something had an impact on openness, which down the line sort of allowed for republicanism or Freemasonry or these other ideas to proliferate. I mean, there's kind of a connection between people like Calvin and Luther looking around at the priest class and being like, all these guys are dumb because there's a smaller pool of candidates because of the Black Plague. So, you could say in that sense, there's this biological impact on political outcomes. It's a bit difficult because then you have to really have a grand theory of left and right to go back 500 years and start talking about left and right. I mean, the French Revolution hadn't happened, but that's my kind of concession is that, yeah, biology can impact politics, but I think on the time scale that we're looking at and things like wokeism, I think I don't think mimetic contagion is the theory that I would go with. I would go with elite theory and technology driving changes in elites, World War II being, the catalyst for a lot of this. I mean, what do you think? Could I be partially true on that, or do you have a slam dunk against that? What's the rebuttal?
Let me make sure I'm understanding your claim correctly first. Your logic is that because selection pressures are far too small, and we can look at the historical examples that we can easily imagine worlds where they're more left or right, and that is due to technological and military victories, that you believe that is the more important part. It's what the elites choose the ideology to be at the moment.
Over the short term, yeah. I mean, over the last 60 years. If you wanna do a bigger theory and say well, let's talk about the French Revolution and let's talk about that, I think then you can make a more convincing case for the influence of biology. But if you were to ask me, is it more likely that environment plays a bigger role than biology, or biology plays a bigger role than environment, I would say 100%. The majority of political shift in the last 60 years can be attributed to historically contingent events, technology, environment, rather than selection pressures causing this on a constitutional level in the way that, basically, the personality theory of leftism is that leftism is a combination of openness and neuroticism. And I just don't think that openness and neuroticism, the genetic frequency of those traits, has changed so radically in the last 60 years that it can explain all of this. Additionally, like I said, because ideology isn't developed by babies, it's developed by people basically from their 30s to their 60s. So when we look at the 1960s themselves, or civil rights, I have an article on the Supreme Court, the Warren Court, that instituted Brown v. Board and ended segregation. Those guys were born in the early 1900s. That's 100 years ago. So really, if you want to say that there's a biological origin of Cthulhu swimming left, of a leftward drift, you have to go back to the 1900s and say that the liberals on the Supreme Court had a lower birth rate than the conservatives. And, if I see the evidence for that, if you were to show me yeah, here, we can define liberals and conservatives, and here's the birth rates for both of them, and look at the difference. I just, from my view of the data, is that the gap has been widening over time, And it really was, there was much more crossover in the 90s, that the liberal and conservative birth rate was within like point 0.2, points of each other, and it's only become like 1.0 over the last 30 years. So it's just so much of these things I think can be explained. I mean, Hananiah's origins of woke, institutions, legal decisions. I think that's much more decisive than these like incremental, slow biological changes over time, which I'm not denying is an ongoing process and maybe amplifies it. But I can imagine seeing data that would allow me to believe like 40% of it was due to to biology, but to say that a majority of it is due to biology just seems like really to ignore historical contingency, institutions, and elites.
Okay. So, first, I think you're getting my claim wrong. I don't believe it's because of selection pressures, like conservatives just have more children, because then that would be in pushing towards conservatism and not the leftward progression of history we've been seeing. It's that leftists' genetics are just higher entropy. So, in like the state of nature, like 1,000 years ago, those tribes that you saw, we would call very leftist. They're very egalitarian, they're very anti hierarchical. And it's only through the selection over war that we get rightism. Rightism is the genetic cause. That's not the right way of saying it. War breeds rightism. Rightism breeds war. And that's how you get bigger and bigger institutions over time in these empires until you get to about the Industrial Revolution, where the things change because people can live longer, they can choose to have less children, all these things. So, because without these selection pressures that you would have in the vast majority of human history, it doesn't select for rightist genes. And it doesn't select for people that have higher mutational load either. So, over time, their genes can mutate and return to that natural state of nature, which is highly leftist compared to, let's say, the median American today. So, of course, you can frame mutational load as a good or bad thing. I've seen you describe it as blaming it on demons and spirits, but it's more just the return of entropy to society, is how I look at it, to their genetics specifically. And my second point is in elites, the heritability of their ideology is far higher than the masses. So for population on whole, it's probably around 60, maybe down to 40, but up to 80 in elites. And in very high elites, you would expect it to be even higher. And as you learn more information, the heritability of politics grows. So it's less that you are coming up with your own argument, but collecting a set of facts that matches your biological temperament.
Okay, so we have two huge disagreements here. One of them is what does it mean to be left wing? I define it as neurotic and open. You say that
And I
primitive
would
people.
say that correlates with this, but I wouldn't say they're exactly the same thing.
So, I actually don't think egalitarianism is leftism in the way that right wing people claim that it is. I'm not totally denying, I'm not totally denying that, but I think if you go back and you look at the primitive tribes and whatever, um, they are, as you describe, as egalitarian. I would also describe them as extremely conservative. And I think this is reflected if you look at hunter-gatherer tribes and maybe just anecdotally or intuitively or whatever. I don't have a study to refer to here, but the Greeks had these concepts of the four humors, and primitive tribes are stereotyped as sanguine, which is the least neurotic type. So they're low in neuroticism, and they are they are low in neuroticism and they're low in openness. They're not open to new ideas. They're not open to new ways of thinking. They're extremely traditional. This is how primitive people are. If you show them something new, they get scared of it and they kill outsiders. And they're ruled by a gerontocracy. They're ruled by old people, and old people are the most conservative type of people out there. they are, when I say that they're low in neuroticism, I encountered this argument recently that neuroticism is evolutionarily adaptive because it helps you run away from tigers or something. You know, you're afraid of the tiger, so you run away, and that's what it means to be neurotic. And I think that's a really weak model of the selective pressures for neuroticism. What I would suggest instead is that most of the selection for neuroticism, it's not a result of mutational load, it's a result of social pressure. And so if you have low neuroticism and you're operating in a dynamic social environment, you're much more likely to make a mistake which has a social cost associated with it, which impacts your reproductive fitness. And one of the ways of modeling this is you have the king's court and you have the king. And if you say the wrong thing, the king cuts off your head. But if you just shut up and you're a bitch, if you're just a beta male, if you're this neurotic, scared, like, oh, I better not say the wrong thing, there's a much higher fitness payoff. So you mentioned like there's this selection for war, selection for the right wing. I think there's something to that. I think obviously having a warrior class that's not hyper neurotic, there's something to be said for that. People who are disagreeable, people who are obviously neuroticism correlates with anxiety and depression. I did write an article where I hypothesized ways in which neuroticism could be beneficial for a military. But we're almost getting into these questions of like, what is neuroticism? What kind of neuroticism? Are there different types of neuroticism? And I would basically say if you have high testosterone and high neuroticism, that's very different from having low testosterone and high neuroticism. Those are kind of
Yeah.
two personality types. So there's a lot of complicated stuff in there. But the point I want to get across is that I think that these quote unquote egalitarian tribes, I'm not denying that there was a form of egalitarianism, but it was an egalitarian, gerontocratic, what's the term for rule by a Judah? It's basically like in the Bible when they say the Israelites didn't have a king, they just had judges. Well, that's the primitive form of government, is you just have these old people who go around judging people. And it's a very conservative form of government. And so I see the left is coming around with openness and neuroticism and saying, no, we're not just going to have this society where there's a class of old people who tell us what to do. What we're going to have is we're going to have this priest class, and the priest class, or sometimes people use the intermediary of the shaman, right? There's this really weird guy who has these like weird personality quirks. For whatever reason, he's able to commune with these spirits. He's able to contradict the elders and institute new laws and new ways of doing things. And this is, to me, this is like the first leftist, is he's like, I'm having these visions and God told us to like start doing human sacrifices, right? If you're a primitive hunter-gatherer, you actually don't see a lot of human sacrifice. You see cannibalism, you see tribal warfare, but you don't see a lot of human sacrifice. You don't see people like taking their daughter or their son and casting them into the fire or whatever. But with these shamans and these priests, you start to get human sacrifices. And there's a question of, did we have settled societies before or after agriculture? Clearly, they were very closely aligned, kind of a chicken or egg situation. But I think that actually you had very complex social structures prior to agriculture. I don't think that actually agriculture caused settled structures. I think it's the opposite, the other way around. And you have to have these socially complex systems, which is kind of bigger than Dunbar's unit. And in order to have that, in order to have a group of people who are strangers and they're not killing each other all the time, you have to have complex, strict social rules. And I think that's what religion does, is it takes people who are strangers and it creates this complex of taboos so that they don't end up killing each other, so that you can have this higher social form than Dunbar's number. And the people who institute that, I think, were higher in openness, higher in neuroticism, and they through tithing took 10% of society's resources and used that to multiply and spread their genes throughout the population. So you started getting a more open population, more neurotic population. And so I see the birth of civilization as a leftist thing. And that continues to the present day with some, there's conservative backlash. So I would say, for example, like the Bronze Age collapse is where these pastoralists come out of the Mediterranean. They start wrecking everybody because these were slave systems, and so they would go around and they would start basically decapitating the government, and everything just fell apart because it was so hierarchical. In the right wing view, hierarchy is the antithesis of egalitarianism, but I actually view egalitarianism as the basis of hierarchy. That you can't have, like, I don't see. I think there's a semantic confusion here where you're calling the gerontocracy an egalitarian society, which in some ways it is. But if you want to go to the next level of social complexity, you have to introduce a priest class who institutes some form of humiliation where everybody becomes humbled before God. And so there's this kind of ideological egalitarianism of we are all subject to God's laws and we're all kind of submissive to God, that creates that really slavery is kind of what I'm saying. Is there's slavery is instituted, and there's a kind of flattening of different tribal cultures, rather than having, well, we just do this because the old people tell us to. That's one model of society. That's a conservative model of society. The leftist model of society is we do this because some priest or some expert told us to do it. And so now we all have to follow that. And so I actually see that as the leveling effect of egalitarianism, conquering surrounding tribes, enslaving people, bringing them back and saying, you're no longer from the whatever tribe. Now you're a slave. Here's your number. And if you mess up, like, this God is going to kill you. So I actually see egalitarianism and the humiliation that you see in, like, Christianity, where, we're all salt of the earth and, the meek shall inherit the earth. I actually see a lot of that stuff. I mean, Nietzsche called it slave morality. I actually think that is the basis of hierarchy, that before you can create complex social systems, you have to completely wipe everybody. You kind of have to tabula rasa everybody and be like, you're no longer part of this tribe. Now you're in the city state and you're all just like a number. You're all just like a slave. And so that's a form of egalitarianism. Now, on top of that is a priest class, right? You see that contradiction in communism where, everyone was a worker, everyone was proletariat, but then you had these commissars at the top who controlled everything. So I actually think that the ideology of communism, as expressed by Stalin, isn't very different from what early civilization looked like in terms of brainwashing people into believing that if you disobey the priest, you're going to die this horrible death. Convincing people of that, I think, actually requires this leveling, this kind of like, oh, you think you're better than us? Oh, well, I'm going to report you to the priest. Like, all of these, like, leftist tactics of social control are the basis of civilization, and civilization can't exist without, like, the nanny, like the basically, what do they call it? Like the secret police, basically reporting you and telling on you. I mean, that's what religion is God's watching you. He's spying. There's like a surveillance state. So that model, I think, is what I'm seeing, rather than what you're saying is that, first the hunter-gatherers were leftists and then the conservative right-wingers came out of that. I view it in the reverse way. I mean, I don't know. Have you gleaned that from my articles, or do you have like a rebuttal to that, or do you see value in
Yeah.
that?
So, are you familiar with the work of Peter Turchin?
I keep hearing him. I'm not familiar, though.
Yes. So, his, let's say, project is just taking historical data and then fitting models onto it to be able to understand the true mechanisms of history. Instead of telling these stories, we can look at, well, if we had this model plus this starting data, you would get this progression of history. And then you can use that to project out. So he was able to predict the mass riots in 2020, a decade prior, by using these models he developed for the dissolution of the Roman Empire, the civil wars in England and all these nations. He fits it onto the US. It tells them that that's going to happen. But we can talk about his model of what causes mass discontent and elite conflict. But what matters for this discussion is that if you do that for civilization, what you find is the two driving factors of civilizational complexity are agriculture and military technology. And the two driving factors for religion, moralizing religion with big gods that tell you what's right and wrong, and if you don't do what's right and wrong, they'll punish you or reward you, is also agriculture and military technology. However, they are predicted independently. So you have religions right next to these massive institutions for the same root causes, but they don't affect each other. So you can have complex societies such as the Inca, which had far less religious moralizing. And side note, I'm descended from the Andes Quechuan people, so that example's nice to me. But like, you don't necessarily have to have this religious superstructure on top of the civilization.
Man, you're gonna
Although, like,
I'm gonna go racist or something. I'm gonna start attacking your ancestors here with my leftism because I'm gonna be like, we need moralizing. Like we need in order to have a really complex functioning civilization, you need to have a priest class that is radically independent from the gerontocracy, meaning that you can very quickly update the software of your civilization and you don't have to worry about people saying like, oh, well, that's not what you said yesterday, right? So it's like when the Mormon church goes and says like, we're not racist anymore, we're not polygamous
yes.
anymore, like the ability to
Do you know that I'm Mormon?
I intuited it with my magic
Okay.
psychic powers. um
Yeah, I've talked about it before, and the way I speak kind of shows that.
yeah,
But
I mean that's an example in modern day, but I think that it was really important to have a functioning civilization, and you needed a way to coordinate people's actions. There's this problem of coordination where you have a huge number of people, it's a large distance, communication is slow, travel is slow. So, how do you coordinate people? It's much better to arbitrarily coordinate. And this is another example from the Mormons is like, they don't even like, the head of the congregation isn't even like the best person, right? It's not like the Catholics where you have to go to divinity school and become a priest or whatever. It's just like they basically, what I've been told is they just choose a random guy and put him in charge. And
and it works.
it's a really good model because
Yeah,
it solves the problem of coordination and it recognizes the fact that it really doesn't matter for what goal or with what theory or methodology. It's like you just need to coordinate people. And if people are coordinated, even if they make a bad decision, like a catastrophically bad decision, it's still more adaptive as a system than having a bunch of decentralized hunter gatherers who are all sort of like intuitively going in different directions and like, well, we're going to go north or we're going to go south. It's like if you just take all of the people and you're like, no, we're going to the land of Canaan or something, and you can like brainwash people sufficiently that they're willing to do that crazy thing, then you can like start a new nation. You can like, take over an empire or whatever. So that's my perspective is that actually being highly neurotic makes it easier to be brainwashed, and being highly open also makes it easier for you to be like open to new brainwashing. So the highly neurotic, highly open person is optimal for social coordination. Whereas the low neuroticism, low openness person is really suboptimal for social coordination because they're like, well, that's not how my grandpapa taught me. And so they're not getting with the program. Now, like wokeness is kind of people are really rapidly, dynamically competing with each other for social signaling, and they're like, well, I have more pronouns than you, and oh well, I took a knee for Black Lives Matter, right? So they're competing to see who's the most moral in that system. And it's kind of like a peacock problem. It's almost like a sexual signaling problem where the peacock tail is getting really heavy and it's starting to cause issues. But I would say that fundamentally, this is actually an easy problem to solve, which is you just go to elites and you say, hey, you know, let's just go in it. Like this is like slight. We need to fine tune this a little bit rather than the perspective of, well, we're genetically deteriorating and that's why people are going crazy and we need eugenics to solve this or something. I guess we don't have really enough time today to investigate this fully. I appreciate you reading my stuff and listening to what I have to say. I'm still, I'm definitely open. Write something about Turchin. I'll read about Turchin. Um, there's definitely way more to learn here. We should definitely have a follow up and have more time to go into this.
Okay.
Um, Give me a preview just during this introductory conversation. What are you working on? What's the next article in store? Is it a big surprise? Is it a secret? What are you up to these days?
Well, considering all the talk about, like, especially this conversation now, I'm very sure I'm going to write an article on the eugenic origins of Mormonism and how that loads far more on agreeableness as the organizing psychometric that allows you to solve this coordination problem than neuroticism and openness. Because I would say Mormons, although somewhat open and more emotionally stable than the American median, they are the highest in agreeableness. And that's what makes the culture genetically unique.
That's very interesting. I love Mormons. I look forward to hearing more from you guys and interacting with you in the future. And we'll keep the dialogue going. We'll keep the discussion going. And I'm definitely glad to have my ideas challenged by you. So thanks for coming on, giving a
Of
brief
course.
introduction. People can go check you out at thelionandthefox.substack.com, and we'll be looking forward to that article. Thank you so much for coming on, Jacob.
Okay. Have a nice day.
Yep, you too. Bye bye. All right. We're switching over now. We're switching gears. We're going to a different gear. What do you think? Stop it there? All right, we'll stop it there and we'll start a new recording.